Right, and good morning. Let me just adjust this camera slightly here. Awesome. Thank you for joining us today. We're busy with Exodus through ancient eyes, and this is the final episode. It's been a very long journey. Well, Exodus is a very long book, and to be honest, we barely touched on all the issues in Exodus, but we did mainly focus on the troubling issues, the issues that if you read Exodus as someone reading it for the first time, there might be some things that stand out to you. Now, we also haven't approached Exodus with a presupposition that it has to all be from one author written down by a man called Moses in the 13th or 15th century BCE. We looked at it from a scholarly perspective, which means we read it for what it says. And if there's issues, there's issues. And then we need to find explanations for these issues. So, some of these explanations that we've put forth in the preceding, I don't know, I think we're on episode 14, are the conclusions of a Professor Pete Enns. And but I also want to say that they are the general conclusions of the critical scholarly consensus. Um, just want to clarify quickly, when we say critical scholar, what do we mean? It's not someone who is critical in the normal sense of the word. A critical scholar is just someone that doesn't presuppose anything about the text. So, apologists who do apologetics come from a presupposition. They decide before they enter the text that the text is 100% coherent, that it was, according to the tradition, most of them written by Moses, one author during his lifetime, that it is completely inerrant, so there can't be any mistakes in it, and that it is univocal, meaning that it all says the same thing all the time. Now, a critical scholar is anyone, it can be a Christian or a non-Christian, and many Christians are critical scholars as well, are people that say, to presuppose all of those conditions onto the text according to our tradition. We are going to put that aside and we're going to read it for what it says and try and sort out the issues according to the evidence that's presented in the book, and trying to get all these data points together and see where it leads us. So that's what critical scholarship means. It means just taking it for what it says, and not doing a bunch of presuppositions, uh, pre-set up boundaries that you can't cross. Um, so that's kind of like the line we follow throughout this, and I hope it's been insightful. I know it's dragged on a little bit, and it's been a very very long series. I acknowledge that, but I think that if you had the gusto to stick it out, you'd have a much better idea of how scholars see Exodus and what are the major concerns they have with the literature we have in our Bibles, but also the actual accounts. So let's just go back to what we were busy with last week. Last week we were talking about the golden calf incident with Aaron and the Israelites, while Moses up in the Mount of Sinai, at the summit of Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. They're having a party down there and they create a golden calf. Now, we set out the proposition that this golden calf story of Aaron is probably based on the account of Jeroboam in 1 Kings, and we laid out reasons for that. And this is something that we notice over and over and over within the book of Exodus. What we notice is that a lot of the story or the account of Exodus is they are literary devices. In other words, they are based on some other ideas. For instance, based on the Genesis account of creation and the great flood, or for instance, like with Moses' birth narrative, based on the birth narrative of Sargon the Great. For instance, as we've just mentioned, the story about Aaron and the golden calf, based on a much later story of Jeroboam's golden calf. So it just seems like there's a lot of stuff happening in the book of Exodus that is drawn from other places to construct the book of Exodus. Now, that's perfectly fine if an author wants to do that you could say, I mean, let me put it this way: this is the reason, or one of the reasons, why many people believe that Exodus is not accurate history, because it draws so much on other literature that we know of earlier or later. Earlier, of course, than when it was actually written, which we estimate to be the 7th century. But most scholars say because of this, there's a very good reason or very good possibility that Exodus is largely mythicized history. In other words, it might have some historical root, but most of it is embellished. We can't read it as strict history. But of course, the opposite argument could be no, the writers of Exodus knew very well the perfect historical account, but on purpose used literary devices to color it in for us. Perfectly fine argument. The problem with this is that if we then found some archaeological evidence, some corroborating evidence from outside the Bible on this Exodus, this account, the plagues, the movement from Egypt, the Red Sea crossing, the 40 years in the wilderness, Sinai account, etc., 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 the second argument could be made, but it's because we don't find any external evidence or corroborating archaeological, literary evidence for the Exodus. That's one of the reasons why scholars conclude that this is largely legend. In other words, some historical kernel, but mostly embellished and then written down much later. Anyway, we go back now to the story. Moses comes down and he sees the calf, and we spoke about that yesterday. 3,000 people die. God sends a plague, but God is still not convinced to move with the Israelites, and he says he'll send an angel forth with them. So Moses is about to make his final plea to get God to come with them, right? So he goes up to the summit again. He doesn't go up to the summit. He makes another move here, and this is found more or less in chapter 33 of Exodus, if you're following along. Moses does not know if God will come with, so he enters something which is called the tent of meeting in Exodus, right? And here he goes to go speak to God, to go find out if God will come with. Now, this term, tent of meeting, throughout chapters 27 to 31, is found regularly and seems to be pointing to what we also know as the tabernacle. Now, just thinking back in my past, these are two and the same things for me and always have been. But we find something peculiar in chapter 33, verse 7. And let me read it for you. It seems like tent of meeting here means something else. Have a look. Now Moses used to take the tent, listen, and pitch it outside the camp, far from the camp. He called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who taught the Lord would go out to sought the Lord, would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Now, this tent does not seem to be the tabernacle we met earlier on. The tabernacle is known, of course, as the place with the incense altars, the tables, and the ark, etc. Instead, this is a tent where God descends in a pillar of fire and smoke, like we've come to meet him, and where Moses wants to talk. It's outside the camp, whereas the tabernacle is built inside the camp. This leads us to the most salient point for this current portion, is that the tabernacle won't actually be built until the end of Exodus, according to the narrative. So the question is, what is this tent of meeting, and is it the same thing as the tabernacle? But as it is already in use at this point of the story, this tent of meeting must be some other smaller, portable type of tent, and not the more elaborate tabernacle. It's not something Moses would just unpitch and go pitch outside the camp to quickly find out what God wants to do. The tabernacle is something they would have normally, they would have moved with it, set it, and only once they move, they would maybe de-pitch it and then pitch it again in their new location. But this tent of meeting we meet here in Exodus 33 seems to be something separate, a small tent that Moses can move, pitch outside the camp, and go find God there. This leads us to the most salient one. And of course, then the tabernacle itself, the one with the 3 sections, that's a replica of the temple, or is based on the temple basically. that comes a little bit later. That gets built towards the end of Exodus. Um, so, excuse me. Yeah. But as it is already in use at this point of the story, this tent of meeting must be something smaller, it must be something portable, and not the bigger, elaborate design tabernacle. This yet again seems to be evidence of the multiple voices that are authoring the book of Exodus, or the multiple sources that's brought together by the writers of the book of Exodus. The tabernacle section of Exodus 25 to 31 was written by someone for whom the tent of meeting was simply an alternative name for the tabernacle. For this writer, any meeting where God relayed commands to Moses could, could happen only in the most holy place between the cherubim and the ark, right? And not in some lesser tent outside the camp that Moses pitches and depitches at will. Many scholars therefore believe that this version of the story was written by someone who represented the priesthood. The second version of the tabernacle or tent of meeting story is what we find here in chapter 33. We also can find it in Numbers 11, 16 to 20, 12, 4 to 13, and Deuteronomy 31, verse 14 to 15. It makes a distinction between the tent and the tabernacle, and it is probably older than the priestly version. In fact, it is possible that the tent of meeting referred to in this chapter was the actual tent of Exodus, and that was the more historical older version. And that over time, as priests got their hands and got more influence over the narrative of Exodus, the tent started morphing under their hand into the elaborate tabernacle that was styled by the writers, finally by the writers after the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. So the order, excuse me, I've dropped something. So in other words, what we have here is we have a very ancient story about the tent of meeting, which is probably part of the oldest version of Exodus. And later scribes, later storytellers, as they became the priests and as the priests gained more power over the narrative, they started projecting the idea of the much later temple back into the Exodus story, which created this dichotomy between the tent of meeting, which can be pitched outside and moved without the actual nation moving, and the tabernacle, which was a three-sectioned, beautiful ornament, particularly designed after the temple, that was only moved, when they actually changed location. So anyway, Moses enters this tent of meeting and is about to do an argument and get into an argument with God. And basically, his argument is very simple. He says to God, you need to see this through to the end. It's not good enough for you just to take me, because God made the proposal. Look, I'll kill all the Israelites, and me and you will go. And Moses says, no, it's not good enough. It has to be everyone. What are the Egyptians going to say? Basically, only then Moses says, will everyone know that we are your people? So God agrees after his pep talk by Moses. And in this case, Moses seems to have the most valid argument, a more valid argument than God. I said a lot about this last week, but it is obvious that the writer here is projecting his own ideas about God into the text, right? You cannot reconcile this with an all-knowing, omnipresent, omnipotent God. He doesn't change his mind or get out-argued by humans. This God, in the way that he is portrayed, or God, in the way that he is portrayed by the writers, is very human, in fact. Right. So this show his commitment to his agreement. Excuse me. So when God agrees, Moses, as he gets the pinky, he grabs the hand and he actually asks God to show me your glory. Or in modern terms, prove to me that you are here and you can go with us. Show me yourself. God agrees on a partial view, the backside, since no one who sees God can live and tell. Although Moses earlier said to see God face to face, we could look at that in maybe possibly in an allegorical way, that he did not actually see the face of God. But here in Exodus, just like in many other parts of the older part of the Old Testament, God is actually portrayed as having a full-on body, face, arms, legs, and so on. And although we read this allegorically today, and even later on, For instance, possibly, let's say, in the after Christ era, of course, the early church fathers read this allegorically. It stands to reason that the people of this time would have very much understood God, possibly very much have understood God, as actually very anthropomorphic, meaning having a body, arms, and so on, etc., etc. They did not read with the allegorical mindset that we necessarily read with. And there's a large argument to be done concerning this. I'm actually reading a book on this at the moment. Anyway, so God agrees, and to show his commitment to this agreement, Moses must cut out 2 more tablets, and he must bring them to the summit of Mount Sinai. Then God passes before Moses, and he declares the following. Let me read it for you. Exodus 34, 6-7. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for 1,000 generations. This is great. Forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. This is amazing. Yet by no means clearing the guilty. Oh, okay. But visiting the iniquity of parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. Now, I just want to read a little side note that I wrote and I inserted in here, because the more I read this, the more it troubles me. And there's a lot to be said about this, and I'm just going to read my comments here, and you can make with that what you like. A quick side note on this particular statement by God, and it seems to be that God here is declaring his character. So, okay, fine, God forgives, but at the same time, he doesn't clear the guilty. How does that work? How do you forgive without clearing the guilty? Because it's only the guilty that really needs forgiveness. And what happens if your parents were faithful, thus securing steadfast love for you, but you are guilty and therefore can't be cleared? Or if your parents were guilty and they secured a visitation of God because of their iniquity for you, their children or their grandchild, but you've become faithful, which of these 2 things win, their iniquity or your faithfulness? How can you then be forgiven? So moreover, what about just simple justice, where everyone gets judged for what they do and not for what their parents did? And finally, this declaration only really makes sense to me as a tool by the writers, not by God, by the writers, to manipulate the audience by using their children, or the fear of the life and the future of their children, the entire posterity almost, into obeying, lest their children carry the consequences of their own transgression. In other words, the writers, which they say is God, could not get people to obey because of the fear of their own lives, or threat on their own lives. So they use a threat on the lives of their children. And the children become the collateral damage in their own disobedience. Once again, we need to see this for what this is. This is humans projecting onto God their own thoughts, methods, desires, character, and contemporary justice systems. They reflect in the text what they would have said if they were God in any particular situation. Also, how do the writers know that what was said? How do the writers 700 years later know what was said between God and Moses? Think about that for a little bit. You have to realize that this is someone writing down what they thought the conversation would have been. I put it to you, this is they're using their collective imagination in here. And unfortunately, it portrays a very human God. There's no way that we have direct word for words of a God to a man, of God to a man that lived 600 years before the one who is writing it, knowing full well that the Israelites really couldn't, most of them just really couldn't write. And we have no evidence of anything being written down before the 7th century. I mean, to be honest, our oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible until last century was about 1,000 years old, about 1000 AD. Those are the Masoretic texts. And then after that, in the 20th century, I think 1950 something or 48, we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which now is our oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. But they also were written around, and like there's a bit of movement in because a lot of books, they're varying books from different times. But I think, speaking under correction, but it's more or less like maybe earliest 100 BC or 200 BC. So the oldest copies we have of anything that we're reading in the Bible is about 1,000 years after this would have happened. The gracious consent of scholars to say, okay, let's push it back to the 7th century, is more just that's the earliest this could have been written down. But we don't have any texts from that time. We only have texts that resemble something like the Hebrew Bible about even 500 years after that. Now, the point is just how we would know what was said between God and Moses is it is basically impossible. And we have to take this with a pinch of salt, right? Okay. Unless you have a presupposition that this is the exact words, and there's nothing you can put on the table to actually prove that. Anyway, so Moses sees this as a very good time to appeal to God's mercy, and he seals the deal. He asks God to forgive the people and to come with him, and God responds, of course, favorably, making another covenant with the people. Or Exodus 34, verse 10 to 28, God repeats at times verbatim what God said in 23:14 to 23, namely that God will drive out the Canaanites and the Israelites are to keep the festivals. This time, however, Moses writes down God's words. Previously, God wrote them down. The finger of God wrote down the words and the tablets, 10 Commandments, but this time it's Moses that actually writes them down, right? Right. And with that, Moses comes down from the mountain. He's glowing. He calls everyone, and he reads aloud the commandments he had just written down on the tablets. And from this point on, he wears a veil over his face whenever he comes out of the tent of meeting. Remember, all of this is happening in this tent of meeting because people are afraid to look at him. Right. So it's quite interesting here that is this right? The first 10 commandments come from the mountain. The second come from the tent of meeting. Basically, just Moses writing them down. Interesting. All right. And so crisis is averted and God is present with the Israelites again. So now moving on from here, God's commands for building a tabernacle and instituting the Sabbath quickly follows this terrible rebellion. And God is furious. All right, this is a quick bit of a recap. So let me just say this. God is furious, just jumping back a little bit. Moses kills people, 3,000. God threatens to kill them all. He recants. He decides to basically let them go on their own. But then Moses convinces him. God recants again. And he still sends the plague anyway. He rewrites the commandments, threatens their children. But in the end, he decides, I will still go with you. Now, this sounds like a very bizarre story to a modern reader. But from an ancient perspective, the punishment would fit the crime. And this is why this makes perfect sense for Iron Age Israelites, elites at this, because this is something that was normal to them. It's not normal to us, right? In that time, the punishment would have suited the crime very well if there was a vassal that rebelled against the sovereign and broken the treaties are portrayed by the writers. Possibly minus the plague. But there can only be one consequence for such insubordination, for such shaming of the sovereign, and this is some instant death has to occur. But in the end, the promise to Abram stands now, and God is back in the game, and some might take offense at this depiction of God and the way that he acts in the annals of the Exodus story. A mere human can calm him down, Moses, change his mind, make him recount. We really have to ask, is this the all-knowing God? And is this the way that we should be talking to him? And do we really think of God like this? And to some degree we do. Because God is often portrayed like this in the Bible. God that can be persuaded, that can be made angry, who regrets actions and ponders the future. In other words, a God that's more like an ancient warrior sovereign, a human king, instead of the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present God many moderns have in mind when the word God is used. Um, this was a God that humans could very much more, or let's say Iron Age humans, could very much more relate to. If we believe that this type of portrayal demeans God, um, we have to deal with the fact that it is still in the Bible. And it is like someone staring at you when you open the Bible. Once you see this and you absorb it, every time you open the Old Testament, you are confronted by this. But we, as well as modern Christians, we still have some remnant of this in the way that we approach God. We truly believe, well, a lot of, let me say, not always Protestant, but, well, Protestant, yes, but definitely from the charismatic circles and Pentecostal circles I come from, we believe that we can persuade God to do things for us. We pray to Him. We wish God, please can you do something? Can you do this? Can you open this door? Can you give me this? Our pleading, we believe, can change His actions and His mind. Like Moses, we plead, we ask, we try to convince God to do something. And we do this to a God that was already going to do what He wants to do. Like He has a will and a way and a plan and a purpose. And we come to say, please, can you change that for me? Can you do for me? And if that wasn't true, then we wouldn't need to ask, because the will of God would just happen. So we truly do believe, even today, modern Christians do believe they can change the mind of God, change His purpose, change His plan in that sense. If we didn't, there's no point of prayer in that sense, the wishing part of prayer, the supplication part of prayer. It would then make no sense to ask if He was going to do it anyway. And there is a portion in the New Testament where Jesus kind of alludes to this. Before you ask, the Father knows already what you're going to be asking. So anyway, besides the point, back to Exodus. God relents and He resumes in chapter 35, verse 1, exactly where He ended 4 chapters earlier, before the rebellion, with the Sabbath command. The ugly episodes sandwiched between the two Sabbath commands then are essentially forgotten. I wouldn't use the word forgiven, because many had to die in the process. But now it's time to finish the job. The instructions of chapters 25 to 31 are followed, the work is completed, and the tabernacle is set up. 9 months after they arrive at Sinai, in exactly 1 year from the day they left Egypt. So it was 3 months to Sinai. They stayed 9 months at Sinai, exactly 1 year. And this is kind of where a new year starts for them. The beginning of a new year, a new beginning for this people, right? Then finally, Exodus ends with a final nod to the theme that's been so central throughout Exodus. The tabernacle story in Exodus 39, 32 to 40, 33 echoes the creation story in Genesis, right? 2 things. The tabernacle is completed, and it uses the same Hebrew word to describe the completion of the cosmos, when the heavens and the earth were finished. Moreover, just as God blessed the work of creation in Genesis 2, Moses now blesses the tabernacle. Right. Israel's deliverance is Israel's salvation, and it is a brand new beginning, a new act of recreation by the Creator. The elements do God's will, whether they be frogs or hail. The sun, which itself long ago gave light at God's primordial command, darkens. The waters separate, revealing dry land, just as the 3rd day of creation. God dwells amongst them in a structure that is nothing less than a downscaled version of the beginning, the cosmos and the paradise. The book of Exodus has set the stage for all the other books of the Old Testament. The departure from Egypt marks Israel's origin as a nation, and occasion um, occasions still memorialized some 3 millennia later in the yearly Passover celebration. As soon as the former slaves will be found, and soon the former slaves will find their kingdom through the pattern, though the pattern of rebellion will continue. Now, us as Christians, what has the Exodus story got to do with us? Very much a lot. It's not just an old Jewish story. A lot of Christian dogma is built upon the foundation of the Exodus story. Christians, we are heirs to the Exodus story. Matthew portrays Jesus as the new Moses, a kind of Moses 2.0. Matthew has a Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus' Sinai moment, and he proclaims his movement to the people below. In the three Gospels, the Lord's Supper is specifically tied back to the Passover of the Exodus, and Jesus' death is modeled after the sacrifice of a lamb. Paul also will appeal to the Exodus in stories, the Exodus story in his own letters, particularly when he compares Christian baptism to coming through the Red Sea. Also, the author of Hebrews, we're not sure who that was, but he speaks of Jesus' followers as traversing through their own wilderness period on their way to the promised land of their celestial home. So Christians do model a lot of their journey, a lot of their beliefs, their salvation, their baptism, a lot of their sacraments are based on the Exodus account. That's why it's such a crucial account. And that's why it's so risky to approach it from a critical viewpoint. Exodus is very challenging, as you have seen. Its readers must grapple with some really troubling moral implications, violent content, and internal and historical inconsistencies. Yet Exodus is also rich. It's a layered story. It has profound influence on Judaism and Christianity. It's hard for readers to navigate Exodus and to avoid all of these elements. Maybe this is exactly why Exodus is worthy of our serious attention. In summary, then, and I've got a couple of minutes for this. In summary of our journey through the book of Exodus, well, we realize that we can't read Exodus as strict history. Um, we see that Moses' life itself, his birth narrative, was based, for instance, on a literary device of an earlier, very famous Sargon the Great. We realize that the dating of this book is set much later than the supposed events, and this is done by the linguistics, the language, the era of the Hebrew that's used in the books, but also the content itself tells us that it must have been written by much later writers. Further to this, that complicates matters for us, is that there are no real external or archaeological evidence that corroborates any of the Exodus story. Um, there are many YouTube videos that will say, we have now finally proved the Exodus, or we have now found Exodus evidence in archaeology. But the reality is that the scholarly consensus is still the same, that there really is no evidence of the story as told by the Exodus account. Is it possible that there were some Israelites, a small group that left Egypt and ended up in Israel? Yes, it's possible. But is it probable that they were a million, that there were plagues, um, that Aaron fashioned a calf? Um, no, it's not probable. Even the conquest accounts, we really don't have much archaeological evidence that corroborates the um, the conquest accounts into Canaanite. Right. At best, it was one of the other things that I don't think I've mentioned this, but it's one of the things that you won't know unless you study the history of the Levant. The Levant is the land of Canaan, where the land of Canaan finds itself. Is that during the time in which the Exodus account was supposed to have happened, Egypt was actually in control of the Levant. And so, leaving Exodus to go place yourself in Canaan, you have not left Egyptian territory yet. They were still in control of that area. So, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense. But anyway, at best, it seems the conclusion, and this is also my conclusion, at best here we are dealing with mythicized history. Um, which means there might be a faint historical root here, but it's been greatly embellished through literary devices, borrowed from ancient literature and even from later Israeli literature. What does all of this mean to us? Well, because we're not dealing with strict history, we can't use Exodus to try and somehow estimate the character of God. And we cannot use the narratives and the laws to copy from that time and paste into our modern lives. It doesn't make sense to do that. The book conveys the dogmas of Iron Age Israelites that are very limited in their knowledge and that understood God and their place in the world in a very similar way to their surrounding pagan neighbors. To form views about God based on Exodus would be trying to box God into an Iron Age cage, a human Iron Age cage, constructed by Iron Age humans. That I don't think is good advice. Guys, thank you so much for journeying with me through this time. Next week, I think we're going to be starting with a series called The Oldest Myth in the Bible. It'll probably be about 3 to 6 episodes. Very interesting. It'll help us place Genesis 1 in its proper place, timeline. But there is a creation myth in the Bible that is older than the Genesis 1 creation myth. And that's the one we're going to be looking at, because that's kind of like the old uncle of the young Genesis 1 creation story. We'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.